previous meeting from 1/20 of 20, copies of which are in the meeting packets. Any revisions or corrections to the minutes necessary? If
Just was wondering how it happened that when I'm gone, it only takes 10 minutes to get through the agenda. Don't answer that.
Well, we've often said that sometimes when the fire chief sends someone else too, we're out in 10 minutes, and when she comes, it's an hour and a half, so you're just special. Or three. So, okay, with that, is there a motion to approve the minutes? Motion by Peckham, second by Herbst. Further discussion? Seeing none, members in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? None are opposed, the minutes are approved. Item number 2 is to consider approval or denial of various license applications. In that, also in with the batch, you'll see a couple of new events. You received an email from Mary on those, the For the Love of Music 5K. I think there was another one in there. I've got to switch back and forth to the email. So those are in the batch. Wausau After Dark, though, is a separate agenda item because that's a brand-new event, so we're going to talk about that next. We have one person recommended for denial tonight. If license is recommended for denial, the applicant has the right to address the committee and talk about any rehabilitative efforts they've been through or anything on their records that may be factually inaccurate. Is Elliot Adams with us this evening? Elliot Adams? Let the record show that Elliot Adams has not appeared. Therefore, his license will remain with the batch. With that, does anyone have any questions about the events that are listed for approval with the batch tonight? Go ahead, Ms. Lawrence.
It is. I can't find it right now, but I had thought that the Wausau After Dark had put an X in the column, like, no, it's not a night event. And then if it were, then there had, were some subsequent questions on lighting and stuff. And now I can't find it. And then the other one I just had kind of a concern about had to do with these outdoor bouncy things, and somehow if you get a wind, off they go.
Oh, for
And
the
it-
family fitness thing?
Yeah, so I suppose that's another item, but, yeah, does your event, question 19, does your event occur at night or continue into evening? And they checked no. If so, what is your plan for lighting and security? I just noticed, that's all.
Yeah.
They
Oh,
should
yeah.
have checked yes, and then maybe had a plan for lighting and security.
Well, it's a summer event, so it's probably light till 9 o'clock? Is that what they
Yes.
were thinking, maybe?
I don't know what they were thinking. I mean, I'm not against it, I think
8,
it's
9
fine,
o'clock?
but,
Yeah, I see they've got the event listed from 4 to 9. So the last one may be close to getting dark, but probably not quite
I'm sure they'll
totally
be
dark,
fine.
but,
But maybe they should have checked yes.
well, maybe.
You
I
want,
mean, it's after dark, it's
Yeah.
called.
But we'll take them, right?
you want the more discussion on Wausau After Dark
With item 3.
with
Yeah.
item 3?
Yep.
Okay.
So we're looking at, for the Love of Music 5K, the Family Fitness Fest, and then the regular renewals, and then the denial for Elliot Adams. Go
Lisa,
ahead.
if I just might mention to Mary, regardless of what happens, Family Fitness Fest didn't sign their indemnification. Some guy just typed a name in there. They really need to sign that and make sure they're like an authorized person to sign.
Before we release the permit.
Right. I figure maybe you do that, but I just happened to notice this.
Okay. And then with that also, we could, if the committee wants to recommend, if the Fitness Fest is having inflatables, we could request that they have that you have a discussion with them about securing those items, so that we'll be down there for those. Okay. So yeah, if they're going to pre-inspect the event anyway, then it's likely a non-issue, so.
Thank you.
Okay. Can or can't have them? Okay, all right.
Thank you.
Yep. Okay, so then with that, do we have a motion then to accept or deny various licenses as recommended by staff?
With the stipulation that we get the signature on the fitness one and that we separately consider the Wausau After Dark one, I would move to approve.
Correct. So a motion by Peckham, is there a second? Second by Herbst. Further discussion or questions? Seeing none, members in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? None are opposed, that motion carries. So item 3 brings us to Wausau After Dark. This is a new event that's replacing Marketplace Thursday. We have our Wausau area events reps with us, and we asked them to attend tonight because the event is so new. We figured that you would have questions for them. Along with this event application comes a request to close 3rd Street for approximately 3 blocks for 5 hours in the evening. And so one of the things that we want to talk about is the street closure. And it looks like their plan is to wristband all in attendance and verify IDs for them, much like they do with Exhibitor. One question that we would have, though, is placement of the beer area and whether or not placement of that in that area is going to create any confusion between taverns and sidewalk cafes. Because you'll know that anyone participating in the beer walk can walk down the sidewalk with their open cup, and state law has changed. We can issue our waiver now and allow for that, but the Mint has a sidewalk cafe, Malarkey's has one, City Grill has one, Back When has one. I don't know if Chow's going to apply for one. And if people leave those seating areas with open containers, that's a problem. And if they walk out of Malarkey's with a container, that's also a problem. So it's going to be important that there's clarity as far as who is able to walk around. Event participants can walk around, but if they see their friend in the bar and the friend comes out with a drink, that can't happen. Because then the bar owner and the person with the cup both get cited. Go ahead, Matt.
So I think full disclosure is that the chief of police and Blake from River District had a conversation at least several weeks ago about this in general terms. And then both Madison, Blake, and Ben Bliven and myself had a conference call this afternoon where we addressed many of these issues. And we had a lot of questions about this event with detailed specific questions like, how is this going to work? How is this going to work? And I think the chief and I both agree that there's a lot of moving parts to a new idea like this. We're not fundamentally opposed. We think that there are plenty of communities that are moving to events like this and they're holding them successfully. And those questions aren't prepared, I don't think, to necessarily be answered in any detail today as far as how is this going to work or how's that going to work. I know that the police department will have to work with the organizers to be able to address those concerns, but there would be a tremendous amount of work that would have to be put into planning, both on city departments as well as the event planners. And I think that the goal was, or as I understood it, Madison, you can feel free to correct me, like, let's get through public health and safety, make sure that the whole concept works, and then we'll work on some details and fleshing out exactly how that's going to work.
Lisa, I had a question too. We just approved the valet parking, and I think valet parking is on Thursday nights, and that would cut off the valet parking that we just approved for
Chow.
Chow.
And Jalapenos now is using it. Also, do we have any issues, the Metro Ride bus runs till 6 PM? Do we have an issue with having to reroute the bus stops during that time?
I'm sure there will be some issues with that. I think things that aren't necessarily clear as to the cross streets, will they be shut down as well? Because keep in mind, if you shut down Third, there's no way we can shut down Scott Street. So we have crossing pedestrians drinking beer, that's a factor that has to be considered there. But you also have Washington Street. Where do you have to shut down Washington Street to prevent people? So you have 2 blocks on either end, east and west, by the mall that would have to be shut down. So
Well, and I think for emergency access, we should definitely have Jefferson and McClellan and while Grant isn't asked to be closed, but the cross streets, I think, should stay open. I mean, if we've got to get in there and get anything taken care of, if that's all closed down like it is during Art in the Park, that's an awful lot of closure to have to navigate.
Correct. I think it's plannable and I think it's doable, but those are challenges where we need to see what's the flavor of the council as far as, and what the request is as far as shutting those streets down. And then we will give an analysis and work with Wausau Area Events to determine what kind of staffing is necessary, because if they're not shut down, and there is cross-traffic going across, I think we have a responsibility to staff every one of those intersections.
With either emergency police or CSOs or somebody to handle the crossing.
Well, that's a whole different topic.
different
we're gonna
agenda item.
discuss
I get
tonight
that,
Because,
but-
because that raises numerous challenges, and are there volunteers for Wausau area events that we're comfortable with working intersections and stopping traffic? Like, these are things that are, again, that's why I'm bringing it to this committee later in the agenda to discuss. Events are changing, and the needs of these events are changing and morphing, and they're affecting both the fire department and the police department as in regards to emergency services and overall safety of those events. Again, I'll just reiterate, we think this is doable, but there's a lot of work that needs to be gone into the planning to be able to answer all the questions that you folks may have right now.
Here, and this is, I guess, the rub with a new event, because we're not necessarily opposed to the event either, but normally, by the time we get to the stage where we're applying for the event permits, all the information we need to know how that event is going to proceed and how it's going to be controlled are here, so we can make a informed decision about the event permit. So this action that we take tonight to approve the event essentially allows the clerk to issue the event permit with all of this stuff up in the air and all these floating parts. And so if something goes very, very wrong, and that planning is not to the letter, that's on the committee. And so I guess I have a little heartburn about approving an event permit before we know, I mean, yes, we know we want to close one street. We've never had a problem with street closures before, as long as we're reasonable about it, and that we can get in for emergency access. But, we close 4th every Wednesday, that's not a problem. We close 3rd and Jefferson during Outrageous, not a problem. But we've got that massaged out to the point where we know exactly what to expect from those events. This one, we have an attendance estimate. It's a fairly sizable attendance estimate. And, I guess I would like to know a little more. I mean, I love the fact that they're wristbanding. They wristbanded all their events. If anybody can handle an event that has roaming alcohol, it's Wausau Events. There's no question about that, because they do it well. But some of the traffic flow and the traffic controls, I think that we need a little more about that. I mean, we can decide it tonight, but
Well, I think, the chief's not available to be here tonight, but we had that discussion this afternoon, and at the end of the day, the chief's commentary to me, which I'll reiterate to you, was it's incumbent upon Wausau area events to work with us to be well planned out, to get all those questions answered and to run a seamless event, because if they don't, we won't let them do it again. You get one kick at the cat, so to speak. The chief's confident that we can work together to answer all those questions and concerns, but I can absolutely appreciate where there are many questions left unanswered in the event application as it stands today.
Committee members, do you have any questions for Wausau Events or for Deputy Chief Barnes? Go ahead, Pat.
Yeah, I guess I'm feeling a little better about potentially approving this, because otherwise I was going to suggest that we direct staff to continue to work with the organizers, but with the deputy chief's confidence, I think we might be able to go ahead. But I'm just wondering if there's any limit on the travel. Once you get a beer in your hand, a lot of these events, we've encouraged people to stay on the 400 block, but this one, we're walking, right?
Well, just like Exhibitor, they'll follow a set route from, either business to business or gallery to gallery. There's going to be vendors on the 400 block, I understand. I guess if you guys want to come up and talk about the event a little bit. What is the radius with which the stuff will be wandering?
Yeah. Can you hear me just
Yep,
fine like
just
this?
fine. Yep.
Okay, so basically, we obviously don't have set in stone plans. Matt told us that you guys were going to be discussing, what you will be kind of requesting for safety of events, and we want to honor that pending the discussion that you guys have here tonight. But we do have all of our safety precautions in order as of now, and then pending any changes that will be happening, we will implement those as well. So for travel, right now we have up and down 3rd. The nice thing is we're working with Wausau River District, who works with all of our brick and mortar businesses downtown. They will be participating within this event. So we're actually encouraging the brick and mortar shops to be out on the street, whereas the restaurants can still be functioning. But the Wausau River District will be hosting business meetings a couple times before this happens to discuss what is allowed inside and what is not allowed out of the premises for each of those businesses and locations. So they have the education, and we have it as well.
Right, because if they're taverns or restaurants, they
Correct.
can't let them out, but if they're other retailers, they likely can.
Correct.
So,
And luckily, we have a lot, we have all of the businesses as of now on our side. So with the valet parking that you mentioned, they're actually looking to participate within that event. So I know that they had spoken to Blake, and he can probably elaborate to one of us a little bit later that that's not something they'll necessarily be needing for that evening.
so they
pending-
would suspend that operation for that night
For
then?
that night, correct, because they want to be a part of this event.
Okay.
As for what we have in security in place as of now, obviously pending your discussion, there will be signage at all of our boundaries. On the way in, it will discuss that they cannot have any firearms or weapons, and then going out, no alcohol beyond this point. You know, we obviously will have our own security officers hired from Wisco Security that will be present, along with any recommendation that the city and police have on what we need there, whether it be CSOs or officers as well. The beer stand, we're looking at location on that City Square Plaza, so enough room to kind of keep that line in queue and moving throughout
Okay,
the
so
event.
at City Square Plaza at Third and Scott, but not in Third Avenue adjacent to the 400 block?
Correct.
That would be a whole lot easier to manage, because it was unclear to me where you were going to position the beer.
And I have a
Area.
map, if you want
Okay,
me to hand that over to you. It's a very nice Google map here, but that little.
that's a much more user-friendly
that little
area,
dot
though.
Right there for
Okay.
you is what we're thinking for that beer stand right there.
Now, the area of that the event encompasses is the entire 400 block and Third Street for essentially 4 blocks.
Correct. So
So-
we are looking at Third Street, obviously, for a vendor location. For Hunter Block, we are looking to host the Wausau Children's Museum and any other children activity that wants to be present, so we can encourage families to be present as well.
Okay? And so then that's, okay. And I guess the other question I would have then is, are you looking at using private security then? I mean, how do you make sure that somebody doesn't, leave the event with that open container and get in a car?
Yep.
Or head down into the other areas?
Yeah, as of now, we have Wisco Security Agency hired to be present at the event. And then, like I said, oh my goodness, pending your conversation today, what we need from, the city recommendation, and then if we need more of our own personal guards as well, we can hire on more. I believe we have 6 scheduled as of now to be present, but if the recommendation is higher, we can make sure that that happens as well.
Okay, so only one central service area, though?
Correct.
Okay.
Can I-
Pass this diagram down so the committee can take a look at it.
Can I make one more
Yeah.
point real quick? In our conversation, one of the things that wasn't clear, and it might not be to you in your application that you're reviewing, is the event is not scheduled to last 5 hours long.
Correct.
So it's 6 to 8,
So the event is
right?
running from 6 to 8, but we're requesting 4 to 9 for setup purposes to get vendors in, and then obviously the removal of them as well.
So that
the
kind of
event itself
addresses your
is-
concern a little bit about the lighting.
Correct, yeah. And if we do end up needing lighting, if it gets to August and it's getting darker, we do work with Sunbelt Rentals on some of our other events where they can provide a whacker light for us to place down there and then move by the end of the event to provide that lighting if necessary.
Sure, go ahead.
So the orange is your boundary, so
Correct.
you will have security guards, like at the corners of the 400 block and Scott, at every intersection?
We'll have
Because you're
them.
having cars go through there, correct?
Yes, we'll have them at intersections. I think we're going to look at getting 2 more to be wanderers as well and just kind of wander through the event, as well as one stationed at the beer tent as well. Also on the wristbands, we had drafted a few. We can actually print what the regulations are and where you can take alcohol on the wristbands as well. So we'll have that listed on there as well as on the boundaries surrounding the event.
Yep. Well, and the 400 block obviously is signed, for the traditional rules that say no alcohol beyond this point at the curb lines.
Correct.
Obviously, that's waived off during this event because we've given you special boundaries, so, because it's a special event situation. But any other questions that committee members may have? Go ahead, Pat.
Yeah, just a little more on the boundaries. It looks like if somebody wanted to have a beer and go to Shepherd and Schaller, they couldn't do it.
Well, they can't take it in anywhere inside any of the brick and mortar businesses. So they can wander those street boundaries, but if they're going into any brick and mortar business, they cannot. Shepherd and Shallard will be one of the businesses actually out on the street though. So I think they'll have a booth kind of outside of their location.
Okay,
that
so I
people
buy
can
a beer
wander.
there and I walk east on Scott. Somebody gonna stop me? I can't.
Yes. We'll have security personnel around the whole.
Wouldn't it make
location.
more sense to make your boundary, anything, you can't go east of Fourth or west of Second?
Street corners would be an easier boundary.
Yeah, we could.
It's easier for people to understand too. The visitors and that need to know, I mean, there needs to be, just like the curb lines on the 400 block traditionally, you need stuff that's easy for people to identify, so,
There will be our sandwich boards that will be at each of those endpoints along with our guards. I can definitely talk with Blake about if that would impact the businesses in any way. He came up with kind of the layout of this event.
Okay.
It was pending talking to the downtown businesses about, so they are, obviously
Right.
impacted and.
well, just given the fact that you're using the entire 400 block and it actually runs all the way to Fourth Street. So,
Sure.
if Scott and Jefferson, if you're gonna utilize those sidewalks or whatever, it would make sense that you end at the corner and not stop them in the alley.
Sure.
Before your office, so.
Yeah, I don't foresee an issue
I
with
think
that
it's
at
just,
all.
is that just easier for people to understand if, the Fourth Street is the boundary. And the west side of Third Street is it for the boundary, and, so that they're not wandering to further west or whatever. I think that makes a little more sense. So, I mean, we would be amenable to either boundary, but I think it would be much easier for you to manage
Sure.
if you have a finite endpoint that's not like the mid-block,
Yeah, I agree.
so.
Nice rectangle.
Right? Okay, anything else, committee members? All right,
All right.
You looking
nobody
for a
else has
motion?
anything? Well, that's what I was going to ask for is, are we comfortable with approving the event contingent upon completion of the coordination between Wausau Events and Public Safety?
I am.
Okay, so do we have a motion then to approve the event contingent upon completion of coordination of efforts between police, fire, and DPW? Because if they need
Yes,
street closures, it's them
We
too.
have several meetings between now and then, and I'm sure that
Okay.
public safety people will bring anything to our
Okay.
attention that needs to be dealt
Okay,
with.
and then so our action here is actually two things. It's to approve the event permit and to offer the waiver for Chapter 9.04.025, consumption or possession of intoxicants on streets. So you'd be approving the event, you'd be granting the open intox waiver, and then stipulating that they finish their coordination with our departments.
That sounds good.
Is that where we're at?
Yes.
Okay, all right, so motion by Peckham, do we have a second? Second by Herbst. Further discussion or questions? Seeing none, members in favor signify by saying aye. Aye, opposed? None are opposed, so that motion carries. All right. Item number 4 is discussion and possible action on necessary staffing levels for special events and CSO summer program considerations related to the same. A few weeks ago, I had a discussion with Deputy Chief Barnes about our CSO program and the popularity. We have some events in Wausau that have become wildly popular and so well-attended that we feel that based on crowd size and ease of access to get people in and out in the event of an emergency, that it makes sense for us to take a look at what staffing levels we have at some events, like the Wausau Festival, the Balloon Rally, and Rib Fest. Some of those events are so large that people are parking, almost a mile away, and the ones that aren't shuttling in are parking everywhere. So, that's right. So, anyway, I had asked Deputy Chief Barnes to bring us a plan, or at least some ideas for how we could manage this better, and he's been working on that. So,
Yeah, I'm not-
turn it over to you.
I'm not sure I have the best plan in the world, but I think it's important that this committee understand and at least we brief you on the challenges in the current state of our special events. So I put together at least some talking points and some possible thoughts and solutions we've been looking for. And the first thing is this really came up to our staff last year when we went to enjoy the Balloon and Rib Fest. I know I did with my wife and a niece and nephew that wanted to see the balloons. And I showed up down there and walked past our 4 or 5 CSOs. I saw my 2 police officers that are there, and I went, there's 20,000 people here. Where are all the cops? And then it dawned on me that it might have been my job to schedule them. So there, by the grace of God and the luck of this community, we haven't had any significant events, negative events that have taken place. And last year, we enjoyed the benefit, which will be another point on here, of enjoying a BEAT grant, which was $90,000 of federal funds administered through the state that we were able to use for community policing events, which our special events are aligned with. The state has decided not to pursue that grant this year, so those funds aren't available to us, which we didn't necessarily know come budget time to be able to address. So in our research, it's really all over the board, but one of the rubrics I saw that was part of federal information on police staffing at special events, if I applied that rubric to, that includes, like, are we serving beer? Yes. Is there entertainment? Yes. Is it outdoors? Yes. It called for 40 police officers and 2 supervisors. Now, I don't have 40 police officers, even if I took every single person to be down there, extra police officers to schedule on overtime to be able to do that. I think that's unnecessary for an event like the Balloon and Rib Fest. I do think it's appropriate for us to have about a dozen police officers and probably a dozen CSOs in addition to our emergency police staff, which, by the way, we're struggling right now to recruit and get people to volunteer to stand out on an intersection all day on a hot day with the emergency police. So our numbers of emergency police officers are going down. We're trying some new recruiting methods and figuring out how we need to reinvent that, because they make it possible for many of these special events to even occur. Because if we had to pay staff to be able to do that, it would make it cost prohibitive. So as you'll notice in the materials I provided, there's a few biggies that we do. Wisconsin Valley Fair, we staff with police officers, we always have. The attendance has gone down at the 4th of July Fair. So we staff it with CSOs and a couple of police officers. We partner with the Sheriff's Department for the Wisconsin Valley Fair. So we provide 6 to 8 police officers each evening out there. The Sheriff's Department provides 2 to 6 reserve deputies, plus all the available CSOs out there. We have 400 block concerts, which are growing in popularity and can average, I would guess, between 1,500, and I think the biggest night I was out there, there were maybe 5,000 people. We jam-packed down there. Apparently Pink Floyd's really cool. When we put the Rib and Balloon Rally on, we also do Chalk Fest. And on that same day, historically, there's a home baseball game at the Woodchuck. So there's lots of events all going on at the same time that stretch our resources. And then lastly is the Wausau Festival, which has grown in popularity at an incredible level. So one issue is, how many police officers and how many CSOs do we feel is appropriate to staff that so we can deal with potential emergencies? And what we tend to do as a police department is plan for the worst and hope for the best. And planning for the worst is somebody wants to drive their vehicle through a crowd. I think I just saw on Fox News that happened somewhere in the world recently. Or worst case scenario is a shooting type incident. Or we could have significant medical emergencies that occur at, from Tracy's end of things. And how are we going to respond to that? Because we will be judged as a community after. And to be able to, like last year, I crossed my fingers all the way home thinking, I sure hope nothing happens, because when something bad happens and they're like, well, how did the police respond? Oh, there were 2 of them for 20,000 people. We would be judged negligent. So we feel there's an absolute need for more staffing down there. But also, this community is known as the special event place. People from all over the country are here, and when I'm down somewhere, they're telling me how great it is, the different things that went on. And that's the result of organizations and people in our community taking the time to put that together. But now that these have grown to a certain size, we feel it's important that emergency management plans are on file, and we change what you get in an event application. So if there's an event of a certain size, and that doesn't have to be decided today, because I'm also working with the county, and they're looking at doing the exact same expectation with their special events applications. But we have one on file for the fair. So we took, and we plagiarized, we took the sheriff's department when they had dairy days and there's 20,000 people coming. We took their plan, which is a FEMA-type plan, and it addresses whose job is it to cancel things. If you have to evacuate, where do you evacuate people to? How do they evacuate? And all these different types of situations. You don't have to think in the moment, oh, this is happening, what do I do? You just go to your emergency management plan because that work's already been done. The county has an emergency management coordinator, Phil Rentmeister. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with him. He used to be the deputy fire chief. And that's one of his roles, is to work with these organizations to put together these emergency management plans. So what I would like to see in the future, and I would propose to you, is that we require emergency management plans that receive the approval of the fire department and the police department. We would look at those. We're not going to write them for people, but the resources are available in this community. We'll work with them to develop their emergency management plans. That be part of the special event application. It's going to be hard for Wausau area events. They're going to be doing the 400 block, and the next group that wants to host an event at the 400 block just takes theirs and says they can tweak a few things on it. That we start to give you folks some idea of what it actually costs to put on a Wednesday night concert on behalf of the city, and that we cost that out for you in staff man hours. So potentially a real change in special events applications and the criteria in which we would need an emergency management plan to answer those questions, which might include how many police officers do we need, how many CSOs do we need, what type of volunteers, who's the emergency medical services, is it big enough that we have to have an ambulance and paramedics on staff and at that location. There's a lot of different moving parts to the emergency management plan. As we looked at some of these events, anybody who wants to talk about anything specific, feel free to interrupt me, or I'll just keep going down my list. At the Balloon and Rib Fest, I have significant concerns that we couldn't get either police or emergency medical or fire staff to someone having a stroke or a heart attack in the event, because there's thousands of people walking everywhere, and we need to be much better knowing where we're going, how we identify where we're going, and we need to be more strategic about creating lanes that we can get opened up. But I will tell you, a secondary concern was if I lived in that neighborhood and there's cars parked on both sides of the street and my house were on fire, how effective would Tracy's team be at getting the appropriate equipment there to put the fire out, or I probably don't eat as healthy as I should, so when they need to come with the paddles for me, that they can get there to do that. And I drove a car through that neighborhood, and it was very difficult. We have work to do if we're going to use that as the venue. How do we, if we have to evacuate because there's tornado warnings coming through, or simply on an evening when it's time to empty that neighborhood of cars, how do we do that? We're going to have to work with engineering, come up with a better plan than we've done historically, because it's gotten so big, which is great. That means it's successful, but now we have to change how we deal with things. And we look at it from a safety emergency response standpoint, but also from a convenience for the city. We can come up with better ways to empty that neighborhood. And every time we talk about this, we get creative solutions on shut down this street, move this. Maybe we have to look at different places for people to park, or doing like the Wausau Festival does in shuttling people in from other locations. And how does that happen?
Well, shuttling or more shuttling, because we are already shuttling to the
Right.
balloon rally, so.
And I don't necessarily know the answer to that. I just know that we would, again, be judged on what we're allowing to occur if a house burned to the ground and we couldn't get a fire truck there.
I've contemplated mass evacuation of the airport myself, from the midst of the crowd, and wondered myself how in heaven's name we would empty that place efficiently, in a hurry, because it's difficult. It's fenced all the way around, and it's got 2 openings. And those openings are, when they're opened up, they're wide openings, but not when a stampede is trying to get through and followed by vehicles. I mean, even for the balloonists to get in and out when the crowd is trying to leave is chaotic. So that is something that, I certainly would not encourage any of our events to change venue. I think we can manage the issues that we have with the venues we have, and I think that if we can get some insight from Phil, that would be super helpful. I think if event organizers, because I'm sure they have the same concerns, the larger the event gets, I think we aren't the only ones that are judged if something goes wrong at the event hosts are too. And so if they can access the knowledge base that we have within our organization, both from police, from fire, from DPW, and from Phil, from emergency management, if they can access those resources, I think that collaboration will yield some fantastic results. And, we often have talked about, in the past, we talked about staffing emergency services for events only in the context of cost. And, well, who's going to pay for that? And we really should charge, and at that point, we weren't even talking about ramping up the presence, we were talking about who pays for the presence. And, historically, the city has, because the city also funds Wausau Events and Main Street, and so for us to increase their costs, at events for which they're already getting room tax grants, it was like charging yourself by the time this was all done. So it's not so much about imparting costs to the organizers or to the events themselves, but to figure out how we can increase safety without impacting the experience of the attendees at the events. I think at the end of the day, you want everybody's experience for those in attendance to be positive, and if something negative happens and they can't get help, that is not our goal either. So, I think that those discussions happening would be really helpful, and I think the fact that we're having them in the off-season is a good thing, because our summer season is around the corner, but we're certainly not there yet. But
One of the things I'm hoping that this committee does, I think that it's appropriate that we start here because this committee's public safety. And so, but there's things that definitely belong in other committees. And my hope is that wherever you deem appropriate to send us to next, that's where we'll go. So, the challenge is we don't have enough police officers or CSOs at these events, in my judgment. And then the challenge that might be in other committees is, okay, how do we get enough staff to be able to do that, or how do we pay for them? The challenges that we're going to deal with is, historically, we have utilized the CSOs to their capacity. Sometimes supplementing police officers, we don't have enough police officers put there, we'll put some CSOs there. They definitely serve a purpose and they do good work at these events, but they don't necessarily, you can't replace an officer with a CSO and call it an even trade. They have different abilities, different training,
they're
different
learning.
experiences. Right. So they positively impact these events, but it doesn't eliminate our need for additional officers. And we have so many events going on in the summer. When I started 20 years ago, there were only a couple of police officers allowed on vacation during the fair because we knew we staffed all these officers out at the fair. If I applied that same philosophy to nobody allowed on vacation, none of our staff would be able to take vacation because we have events, and then that affects the health of our officers and union contracts and issues with that. So I don't have an answer yet on how do we get enough officers to be able to do this. It would clearly be on overtime for them, which
that was my question, because it really is a situation of backfill on overtime versus hiring additional full-time positions. I mean, if we were going to look at the nuts and bolts of staffing requests, I could certainly see the need to ramp up shift staff during events, but events happen, on set days, and they're predictable, and we know exactly when that need is going to be. So I think that our path to that is certainly not to globally increase the size of the patrol staff, but to infuse the CSO program, perhaps with a few more people. And I did see in your potential solutions that you had listed in the meeting packet, you were talking about even looking at some part-time mentoring, seasoned staff or retired officers that could mentor the CSOs, get them the education that they are seeking anyway by taking the CSO opportunity, and then supplement their efforts, there, much like the county does with their reserve deputy program. And so
That's one potential. I don't want to lead this group astray and think that that's this panacea that solves our issue. I'm talking a couple of part-time police officers that hopefully I can get 30 to 40 hours a week during the summer. These would be ideally retired officers that have a tremendous amount of institutional knowledge and have a desire to mentor and lead young people. I wouldn't be here if I hadn't already talked to some people that I have in mind for that. But we may be reaching a point as a community where we need to function very similar to communities like Tomahawk when they do the fall ride. Wausau Police, they put out the word, hey, they hire police officers from all across central Wisconsin to go to Tomahawk that weekend and they patrol Tomahawk during, when there's an influx of all these people there who are partying and having a good time and riding their motorcycles. So we'll send crews of Wausau police officers up there. Merrill sends officers, the sheriff's department sends officers everywhere that they can get an officer from. And they pay our overtime rate to be able to do that. So to your point of, I'm not advocating for us hiring an additional 10 officers to be able to staff special events in the summer.
Right. And I don't want the public to think that either,
Right.
because that's not the solution.
That wouldn't make sense at all. However, if we need a certain number of police officers at an event in order to be safe and feel like we're covered in case of an emergency, then that might be a potential solution, is to, instead of paying overtime to our staff that we don't have to be able to fill there, we might be putting the word out to other departments. It's really a policy. That's not something we've ever done here to staff our special events. It could be hiring, I mean, our first ask would be of the sheriff's department to provide us with staff from their regular staffing, because they're familiar with the community, they understand our communication system and how things work. But depending on the size of the event, that might be different, and that's just not something we've ever done. Historically, we've hired 12 CSOs. If you think about the Balloon and Rib Fest as one particular event, we have CSOs that we need down on the 400 block, making sure nobody's messing with the chalk art. People put a lot of effort into that. They want to know that it's protected from one day to the other. And we need to make sure people are behaving. We're contracted with the Woodchucks to provide CSOs at all the home Woodchucks games. And then we have the event going down at the airport. 12 gets split pretty tightly at that point in time. And then our challenge is, the way our organization is set up right now, the lieutenant responsible for our drug unit, and it's good for our community, they're really busy, and they're arresting a lot of people. That's Lieutenant Melinda Pauls, and she supervises the CSO program. So she's not out all weekend long dealing with situations with her CSO staff. So we have one of our school resource officers that we have worked with CSOs during the summer, and that's just not enough. And as you'll see, I'm looking to take the number from 12 to 20, because we need to be able to split them in more directions. The expectations I expect this community to have on us this summer are going to grow. There's tremendous investment on the Riverwalk. I see, if I'm a young family and I take my kids down to the really cool playground, I'd like to know that there's people staffed down there all the time that are making sure that it's a safe place to be.
Yeah.
So we're expanding the needs of our CSOs. I think we have work to do in other parks. That's a side benefit, because special events aren't going on all the time. So what do we do with these individuals? So that's the giant assumption, that I can find 20 people that have the character that we're willing to hire as CSOs.
The numbers that you submitted associated with such a plan are not particularly shocking. Putting my finance chair hat on for a little bit, I would like to have a conversation, or I would like us to have a conversation with Mary Ann about surplus and savings, either in other areas of your department or in the 2019 budget as a whole. And then going forward, I would also like to have a conversation with her about room tax, because there is a percentage of room tax that the city keeps for operational expenses, including maintenance of the 400 block and some of that park staff, the turf maintainer that they hire, part of that guy is paid out of that fund. And so I would suggest that maybe a percentage of this could even be, if it's policing events and enhancing safety at events, that may be an eligible expense for that going forward. Now, room tax has been allocated for 2020, but every year, twice a year, there's 2 more allocation cycles. So that's something that, we should talk with her about, the percentage of it that the city keeps. We use it for things that drive tourism and create more events. That's what we try to use it for historically. And so if this is part and parcel of that, I guess I'd like to see us talk about, maybe getting some of this money from something like that on a cyclical basis. So we can have that conversation with her offline, and then likely in the finance committee also.
Yeah, I think one of the things I was hoping, and I'm more than happy to answer anybody's questions or concerns, is to get some direction from this committee as far as what your expectations are of us. We're telling you what we think we need to do in order to have safe and prepare well for these events. But what I don't know is whether you agree with me.
Well, what do you think, committee? Go ahead, Becky, first, then Linda.
I wrote I don't know if I included you. I know I did Chief Bliven after I was at the balloon rally. It was quite the show. I was worried about the CSOs as the mass exit on that time. And I'm also transit chair, and I know Greg was, beside himself about how, the exit happened. The CSOs were just overwhelmed. You could just tell they were just overwhelmed. They didn't know what to do. People were basically running over them, and our transit buses were stuck on the other end and couldn't get through. And so that lasted for an hour.
To shuttle people back to their
shuttle
cars, they
people,
were stuck on
And then
Lakeview.
people were concerned because the shuttle ends, and will all these people have a shuttle to go on? So we ended up going overtime because we had to have the shuttle going till 11:30 or so instead of when it was supposed to finish to get everybody out. And it wasn't safe. Those buses were like this because people were running in front of them.
Oh, wow.
So I need Wausau events to please work with our transit director. And please work, I promised that I would continue to beat that drum, that we need to work early, and he needs to work with the police in maybe setting aside a lane just for the buses, because we need to shuttle them, and we can't have people crossing in front of the bus. There will be an accident, there's no doubt. I do agree with this with the CSOs, or whoever, police, because something will happen at some point.
So I will tell you that if at the end of the day, after it goes through all the committees and it goes to council, the decision is, we'll give you the 20 CSOs, but not the police officers, that's a deal breaker for us, because as great as young 20-somethings are, as they work their way through their education, they need leadership and they need oversight and supervision, and I just don't have that to give them right now, and that's the role these individuals would play. So if we are going to increase the CSO budget and allow us to hire additional CSOs, from my standpoint, that's contingent upon us getting some additional funding to hire some
I
part-time
think the request for both
officers.
should be submitted together.
Together.
The 8 extra CSOs and the part-time mentors, I think that request should come in together, and I think it should be listed as summer event specific. Just because it's a defined need, and it's a targeted need. And so, that's something that we certainly can look at. Now, in connection with, public safety at events, as we talk about staffing levels, that historically, we always have had our firehouses staffed at minimum staffing levels. And if they are inundated with calls and the worst thing happens where somebody drives a car through an event, we have not increased the size of the fire department staff for decades. To address other issues that we've had, we've increased the size of the police department a few times, but we have not added fire and EMS personnel or equipment. So that's something that down the line is probably a conversation worth having as well, as, what we do with that, because, their ongoing staffing need and their minimum staffing level situation has been perpetual for as long as I've been on the council, and our population is aging. And if we want to grow our community and increase the size of our landmass and our population, that conversation is going to have to happen too, in general, not just for events. So I recognize that. Go ahead, Chief.
I came to Wausau about almost 6 years ago, and the events here have grown so much since I've been here. And Matt hit a lot of the concerns right on the head. Becky, you just mentioned the ingress and egress out of those events, particularly the Balloon Fest. We usually staff that event. We get requests all summer long to staff events, but we are just way too busy to do standby events. We do a couple of them, and we hire back. But if we would hire back for each event that requested a standby, for one, as you mentioned, Lisa, we don't have the equipment to do it. We only have 5 ambulances, and most of the time, we have 4 of them busy. And we have a 5th reserve, but there's lots of times that we have an ambulance out getting preventive maintenance or some other kind of maintenance, or something's broken down. So lots of times we only have 4 ambulances available to us. But we actually stood by at the Balloon and Rib Fest, well, we always have, but last year, it was very difficult for them to even maneuver through the crowd. So as Matt had indicated before, if somebody would have had an emergency somewhere in that crowd, it would have been difficult, number one, to get to, number two, to locate them, and number three, to get them out of there. When we left that particular event that night, because our fire truck actually stood back by for the fireworks, for the just in case, it took them almost 2 hours just to get out of there. Now, if we would have had an emergency, realizing we only have 3 stations and 3 engines, we would have been lost an engine to try to get there. So we would have depleted our resources by 1/3 because we were unable to get out of there. It was very concerning. And we've talked about this since that event. And as far as that goes, we had an ambulance there too. We just got our ambulance out of there because we were very worried that we weren't going to be able to get it out of there otherwise. And I think that pedestrian crossings and the way pedestrians, especially at night after a few drinks, and they're trying to maneuver to get to their car and parking, it's very dangerous to try to get traffic and pedestrians through there without, like Matt mentions, without plans. But we're requested all the time how we select what we stand by and how we don't. We don't have a way to do that. If we would have some type of regulation and licensing type of something for large assemblies, that would give us some way to be able to indicate what we should do and what we shouldn't do. And so we're at a loss too, because we don't have the budget for that.
Well, that's just it, and I think if we're going to start to have more and more events where the crowd exceeds 5,000, that really, I think, is where the rubber meets the road. The average Wednesday night concert you can work with.
Right.
And even the 4th of July thing and just some of the stuff at the woodchucks, you can work with that because it's not so bad. But when you have, over 5,000 people concentrated in an area, and, some of the areas that we've designated for events, we've picked areas that are enclosed by nature and we also then have lifted the enclosure requirement for the beer in those venues because they're self-contained. Well, self-contained can be a blessing and a curse if you have to get in and out quickly. So,
When I first arrived here in Wausau, the first summer I was here, we talked about egress out of the Balloon and Rib Fest and creating more egress just for the public. So in case there's something that would occur, they're not running into the airport. They have other ways to actually get out of that area because that fence goes around the whole area.
well,
So
that's the thing, and we need to find a way to really get people in and out of those gates. And, we do have 2 very large gates, but, we can't have them running all over the tarmac either.
No.
So go ahead, Matt.
I just wanted to quickly address that, and I know I'd mentioned this to you, like, Wausau area events came to the police department, we had to sit down, we talked about this particular issue that was coming here tonight, gave them some notice that we were going to be talking about a lot of their events, and we're really lucky to have great partners with them because there's no conflict over what needs to happen and the type of planning that needs to be put in place to be able to address many of these needs. They recognize that relies, in some cases, pretty heavily on staff of the city. But again, these are all plans that I think if we put our noses to the grindstone and try and think through creative solutions to all these problems, it's totally doable down there. I mean, the city's invested in that event taking place down there. So I just wanted to acknowledge that Wausau area events it sounds like we're saying this is really hard and this is really hard, but the fact of the matter is they work really well with us, and we've never had any issues doing that.
That's one thing I want to do is commend our event organizers because we have had good partnerships with them. And, I think a lot of our events now have come to define our city. And, they're annual events that are so well attended and they bring so much tourism that they've become part of Wausau's identity, especially with the Balloon Fest and that. And even the kayak course and, events like that where they've become iconic. And so, I want to be clear that our goal is not to hinder or restrict the number of events, it's not to move events out of venues, it's not to charge events in some crazy way that they can't, their overhead is so high they can't afford to operate. That is absolutely not our goal. Our goal is to make sure that we can make sure that people can get in and out of the events safely and enjoy them safely, and if there's a crisis situation, that we can respond appropriately and not have a tragedy because we didn't plan. Committee members, anything? Go ahead, Ms. Lawrence.
You kind of answered my question, but are your numbers for the additional 8 CSOs and the additional, use of retired officers for training and mentoring, are those pretty firm at this point, or not?
25 and 35 roughly?
25 and 30? Because what I was thinking is, because it takes time to get them, and we're going to have another busy summer, hopefully, is that we could take that kind of request to the Finance Committee after you meet with Mary Ann, and then, I don't know if you want to look at a subcommittee of this group or staff just meeting with you, Lisa, in terms of looking at the minimum number of attendees for emergency management plan or the police officer presence, so that we can get that moving in before summer, too.
I think that those discussions already are happening between both of our public safety departments and the event organizers. I think if they'd like a liaison from this committee, we certainly can engage a committee member. I mean, I'd be happy to attend those if you want me to, just as a liaison to figure out if we need anything on our agendas or if there's decisions that we need to make along the way. For this year, for the 2020 event season, if we were to get something like this going, and we'll have to check with Mary Ann, but I think the fund source is likely either budget savings, cost savings in other areas, or it could possibly be 2019 surplus. We just have to see where we ended the year and see what that looks like. Going forward, though, for 2021 and beyond, I would like to have a real conversation about at least a percentage of it, that we could maybe consider some of that from room tax, because it is directly tourist-driven.
I mean, in case you were wondering, like, what's my perfect world to get through the summer and try this experiment and see if we can get this many, would be 25,000 for CSOs and 35,000 for 2 officers worth of time. And I say 2 officers, but it's important to understand with the CSOs and officers in this context, it doesn't necessarily represent 2 officers, it represents a budget. So if I can hire 4 part-time officers to fill this, and instead of working 40 hours a week, they work 20, or I can get people on super busy weeks to have 4 of them work 40 hours, and like, we're controlled by the budget that's established for us, not necessarily by the number of employees.
Right. So you want to maximize your return on that investment, and so if you can get, maybe more bodies on shorter hours, so you can spread that out a little more, however that works out. But I think the line item, if we can work through the finances with the finance department, and get something set in motion, that discussion can happen in finance anytime it's ready. So I guess I would encourage you to network with Mary Ann right away. And, I'm happy to join that conversation if we need to. And, but separate from that, I guess what I'm hearing from the committee is they're supportive of this effort to find a way to plan ahead and anticipate things that, you think about, but you don't necessarily write down on paper, or we haven't to this point. Now, event organizers should be able to access Phil Rentmeester's advice without a cost. Is that correct?
Correct. And, some of this conceptually about what an ideal state would look like in special events is the ship's kind of left the dock for this year. We'll have to work with the events specifically. But in our perfect world, come next year, we would have a clear path for event organizers. There's somebody new that wants to put on an event that says, this is what I think I'm going to do. I want the 400 block. I'm going to bring in a concert. This is how many people I'm anticipating. They can go, oh, it's going to be this many people. This is what I need to do. I need to check these 5 boxes. Here's the work that goes into it. And there's no ifs, ands, or whats about what's required. It's clearly been articulated. The council approves. This is how we're going to run special events. And those are the changes that need to occur. And the police departments, although we haven't gotten to it yet, we're facilitating a meeting between Wausau Area Events, the fire department, the police department. We might bring Phil on board to look at what exactly does this look like, and Phil can speak for himself as far as what he brings to the table. But historically, the person in Phil's position and Phil also have sat down and worked through the emergency management plans. And my understanding is that's part of his job description, and there's not a cost to using the
His
county's
services.
emergency management planner for that purpose.
Okay. And if it turns out that along the way there's changes that are necessary to the event application, either to get some uniformity or to ask questions we haven't asked before, I think those event applications can be adjusted by the clerk's office without committee approval. if you find that there's something that we've not been asking that we should start asking, I think that you can get with Mary and Leslie and, if they need to add some questions, for those size of events, we certainly could revise those without committee action. So what are your thoughts, committee? Anything else? Go ahead,
Would you like
Matt.
a motion stating the committee's support for going forward with this at a cost not to exceed $60,000 and,
Well, I think finance can really
Well,
articulate the dollars. I think if you wish to move this plan forward, I would say that, maybe an appropriate motion would be to say that the committee recognizes the need for a program like this connected to events, and then forward a recommendation to the finance committee to fund a plan in concept similar to what Matt's laid out here. And then he can take those numbers to the finance committee. They may be a little more clearly defined by the time he gets there, after you have some discussion with Mary Ann and that. And then finance would happily consider that.
in general terms, I would make that motion that the committee support a plan of this sort and would ask that the finance committee work to make it happen.
Okay. Do we have a second then to Pat's motion to forward this plan? It directs staff to continue to pursue this plan and to network with finance and the finance committee. Second by McElhaney. Further discussion or questions? Seeing none? Oh, go ahead, Dawn.
Oh, I'm just going to comment on Matt's.
Is your mic on? I'm sorry.
I'm usually pretty loud. Just to comment on what everything that Deputy Chief Barnes has said, I worked the balloon rally for all its existence, and I retired after 20 years last year, and I can tell you, it is a nightmare at that balloon rally. It was nice to see it was the year before, 2018, where they decided that they couldn't park on both sides of the street on
Of
Lakeview
Lakeview.
Drive anymore.
Yeah.
That was great. They also figured out to let the balloonist and these vendors come in right where I believe the baseball diamond is. So then you still have only about 2 exits and entrances that people can come and go. And I was directing traffic, and I can tell you there were so many near close accidents on Lakeview Drive. I mean, people don't even pay attention to officers, CSOs, or even the emergency police. It's like, hey, I'm going to cross. And it's like, wow, this car just missed you by inches.
Oof.
And it's scary as all get out. So I'll tell you, I'm totally in favor of having extra people there because the balloon rally has become one of the biggest events that we have this summer.
It is, and that's the
Yep.
thing. We want them to be successful. We want them to be bigger and well-attended and wildly popular, but we want to be safe too. Go ahead, Matt.
I just want to, so that I understand, included in your motion, Mr. Peckham, is it fair for me to assume the direction of this committee is to continue to work on identifying staff requirements per size of events and to work through redeveloping the expectations of special event applications?
Yes. Right? That's what I was hearing. Okay. Yep, so that, yes, that directive all comes with it.
I think we appreciate all
it's a
this
tall task.
being brought to us, and, it is several things there, but it's good that we do need to think about it.
Well, I
We
love
can't
that we're
just-
ahead of it before something bad has happened. I mean, we love the fact that we have this problem. It's a great problem to have, and so we'll solve it. So that said, with a motion and a second on the floor, members in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? None are opposed, so that motion carries as well. So thank you for that research to date, and then we'll look forward to some feedback after, and then a request to finance. Item number 5 is the operations report from the fire department for January of 2020. You've got that report in your packets. Anything notable on the report that you want to talk about, Chief?
I don't have anything
Okay.
additional.
Does anyone have questions for the chief? If not, we'll place her report on file. Also is, item number 6 is tavern activities, compliance checks, and law enforcement activities. You have that report in the packet as well. Anything that you have questions for Deputy Chief Barnes on regarding the tavern report for this month? Or events that have taken place? I mean, that narrative is all in the, in there. If not,
I have a couple of
you
questions
want,
for
go
the
ahead,
committee.
sure, yep.
This one wasn't even my idea. This was the chief's, told me to make sure I went through this. If you'll notice in the bar report, you'll notice when under Rock's Place, we had 2 incidents this last month. one including the discharge of a firearm in their parking lot, and one including the threat to return with a firearm, although that individual didn't return with a firearm. On September 5th, the chief called Tim Naraki, who's the owner of Rocks, into the police department. I had a conversation with him about expectations and the need for him to make sure that he maintains control of his patrons in his bar. That's the result of, if I look over the last 24 months, there have been 23 fights or at least verbal altercations or physical fights at that location that police have had to respond to. And there have been 3 different incidents involving firearms at that bar. Now, the reason the chief wanted me to identify this is by the letter of the points assessment, they're calling the police and they're working with us and they're meeting the expectations that we set forth about providing us with video and calling us when there's an incident. So points are not assessed. So that type of activity at his bar with the fights and guns going off in the parking lot doesn't ever get flagged to come before you. And you would have to pay attention to, you'd have to reread all the bar reports from previous months in order to flag that yourself. So we wanted to bring that to your attention in case, because all the points do is notify you that there's a potential issue. In this case, we think there are some issues occurring with the patrons at Rock's Bar, and we wanted to identify that for you in case you had some direction for us or you would like to speak to the owner.
We actually have had Tim here before, and after his first appearance with a formal expression of concern, a number of years ago, things did seem to get better, and he was requesting additional patrols, and the networking between the department and the owner seemed to get better. It seems like that's slipping backward now. I mean, I've been dealing with them long enough that it's been a long time, and it seems to be regressing there. We've also had the owner of M&R Station in here when we had the issue with the patron that had overdosed in the bar. And, that, we didn't wait for those to get to 100 points.
Well, I'm getting to M&R,
So-
they're next.
We didn't, okay, but we didn't wait for them to get to 11, or to get to 100 points, because sometimes by the time you get to 100 points, based on what's all been happening, sometimes it feels like they should have 200. So this 23 calls is a lot, and whenever there's weapons present, I think we're concerned about that.
Well,
You know,
there's a
and-
lot more than 23 calls. Those
Well-
are just the calls that were fights.
And one other concern that we have had with other establishments is bouncing stuff out into the parking lot and then letting it become a medical emergency, and, not calling soon enough. And so I would be happy to have a conversation in the committee with the owner, if the committee is up for that. I mean, it doesn't necessarily, we don't have to wait for 100 points. You could summon the owner and have a discussion with him right away. If,
Given the attitude that we're hearing about, I think that would be a good idea.
okay. All right, so then we will agree that we would like to invite Mr. Naraki to attend our April meeting.
Okay.
And we'd like to have a conversation with him about what we've been seeing on the report. And if you want to continue about M&R, go ahead.
Yeah, at the risk
They're
of-
next on here, I see.
At the risk of making one of your future meetings really long then, M&R Station, although not included on this bar report because it's relatively recent, is hitting 100 points, and they will have hit 100 points by your next meeting, because we're assessing those right now. So I bring that to your attention because, okay, you'd see 100 points at the next meeting, then there'd be a whole nother month that elapses before you'd have the ability to call them in, as opposed to being informed of that right now and being able to call them in at the next month's meeting, if that's your choice. The issues with M&R Station, again, Rick Gordon, the owner of M&R Station, was called into the police department to address his cooperation and attitude and how he deals with our officers when they're there dealing with situations. In no uncertain terms, that the chief made very clear, so that I think half of the police department could hear, made very clear what our expectations are of him. And then just the other day, we have an OWI in the parking lot. We asked for the video, which he's agreed, hey, I'll cooperate with you guys. And our officer goes there and got nothing but what I would consider a disrespectful or dismissive, or at the very least, this incredibly uncooperative attitude from Mr. Gordon. So we know he's hitting 100 points. We feel that if you are to call him before the committee, the sooner the better. And then that's the first question. The second question is, due to us wearing body cameras, would you rather us explain what those interactions with him are like, or would you like a show and tell and you can watch it for yourself?
I think that we would, like, we have before seen the video, I guess.
If there's going to be some kind of potential action or revocation, you need
We would
to
save that.
remain
Okay,
a
so-
neutral body.
Okay,
I
so
would
that,
ask
usually
not.
what we do then, and what I was going to say is we save the video evidence for a revocation hearing or non-renewal. And so if it becomes necessary, I would say as long as we have that evidence saved, the committee would see it then if it needs to take more extreme action. But if you want to put up, a written report of what the experience has been there, based on those interactions, we'd certainly accept that and review it before they get here. But committee, what are your thoughts about bringing in Mr. Gordon then also for April? Clearly, we have a problem on South Third Avenue between them, so, okay. Yes, why don't we agree then, we'll summon both of them for our April meeting, and we'll go from there, so.
Otherwise, I have nothing else to add in the bar room.
Okay, does anyone have questions then for Deputy Chief Barnes on anything else contained in the report? If not, we'll place his report on file as well. Item 7 is communications. I have none, other than the introduction of our new city clerk, Leslie, who today is her first day, and this is her first committee meeting, so welcome, and you guys get to be her first committee, so. So, yes, invite them for a formal expression of concern and a dialogue about
Please.
recent events at the establishment for both, yes.
Lisa?
Yes.
Just a comment reminiscent of the night of our diversity training when someone said, gee, there's not enough to do in Wausau. I don't remember the exact context, but they should come and sit in on one of these.
Well, this is the best free entertainment, right? So.
No, I meant there's a lot of stuff to do in Wausau.
There is a lot of stuff to do in Wausau, at least administratively, there's a lot of work to do in Wausau. So that was the only communication I had, was to welcome Leslie. If nobody else has any, motion to adjourn is appropriate. Motion by Herbst, look how fast her arm flies up, I love it. Do we have a second? Shoulder must be better. Second by Peckham. Members in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Aye, we'll stand adjourned, thanks, everyone.